From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We start again today with a report on the markets. For that, we turn to Kaylee Lyons. So, Kaylee, not a lot of conviction, but NASDAQ seems to keep tearing on up.
Yeah, that is absolutely right, David. We've actually seen the S&P 500 flip between positive and negative territory. Right now, it's up just a few tenths of 1%. The Dow is basically flat. But once again, as you alluded to, it is a tale of tech outperformance. The NASDAQ far and away the outperformer on the session. It's up about 0.8%. This index just continues to climb higher. And David, of course, that is thanks largely to the heavyweights within it. I'm thinking the big five stocks, the Apples, Microsofts, Facebook of the world that continue to just power this equity market higher. It seems investors really just seem to be favoring these names over any others, given the fact that they are high growth, that they have strong balance sheets, can weather any kind of economic downturn, and of course, the fact that they have services and products in which are more demand in a stay-at-home world as we continue to see virus cases climbing. Johns Hopkins University saying just moments ago we have now hit 3 million in the U.S. And that's reflected in the sector composition in the equity market as well today, David. We see that it is technology, of course, outperforming up a full 1 percentage point. Well, at the bottom, it is those more cyclical, growth-sensitive sectors, industrials, energy, materials are all lagging very hard in today's session, David.
Yeah, which takes us really back to the coronavirus, as you suggest, Kayla. That makes sense. At the same time, gold has been climbing pretty steadily. Where's the dollar?
The dollar is actually weaker today. It's interesting. We're getting kind of mixed messages from each of these asset classes in that usually a weaker dollar indicates more risk appetite, more confidence about growth. But you aren't seeing that reflected in gold. As you alluded to, gold is now at its highest since 2011, so 9 years. It's above $1,800 an ounce. We see ETF holdings in gold, for example, at record highs. So clearly there is still appetite on the part of investors to hedge some kind of risk here, even if the markets are moving higher because big tech is carrying us, David.
And at the same time, the VIX is relatively modest considering where it was before. The VIX is not indicating a lot of volatility.
Yeah, we're right around a 29 handle today, but it is all relative when we talk about volatility. Yes, we're not at an 82 like we saw back in March, but we are still elevated relative to history. Right now, the VIX would indicate that we're expecting swings of nearly 2% daily for a month on the S&P 500. Again, not March, where we were implying that the market was going to swing 5% a day. Wasn't all too out of the question then. Today, the market isn't seen as swinging that much, but again, relative to history, that is still quite elevated. That fear gauge is still a lot higher than it has been historically, David.
Okay, Kaylee, thank you so very much for that report on the markets today. That's Kaylee Lyons, one of our colleagues here. Meantime, let's go back to that subject of the coronavirus and how states are really fighting against it. We're very pleased to welcome now back to Bloomberg Ned Lamont. He is the governor of the state of Connecticut. So, Governor, thank you very much for being with us. I mean, it's a good day, I think, for you to come on because last time I saw you reported 0 fatalities for the first time since March. At the same time, you have postponed indefinitely the phase 3 reopening. Why the caution when the numbers seem to be doing so well for Connecticut right now?
Nice to see you, David. We've got about 95% of our economy open right now. But when it came to bars and nightclubs and big entertainment venues, I listened to governors from Florida and Texas and the such saying they regret that they did open their bars when they did. And that was an opportunity for some super spreading to go on. We don't want that to happen. So in abundance of caution, we're not going to open them yet.
Well, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as I recall, which makes good sense. How concerned are you about people outside of Connecticut? Certainly some surrounding states, even New Jersey now seems to be ticking back up, but certainly in the South and the Southwest, there are concerns about people coming from those locations into the states up here in the Northeast. How concerned are you about that? I know you have a quarantine in place. Is that advisory, or can you enforce that?
I'm very concerned. Thankfully, we got good neighbors. Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, they have low infection rates. But you're right. If people are flying up from Miami, flying up from Houston, coming in unchecked, that's a problem. You need 1 or 2 people infected on that flight by the time it lands. Who knows what's going to happen? So we do have a quarantine in place. It is voluntary. That is true. But I'll tell you, the number of people flying into our state from those infected areas has dropped quite a bit, which is the precaution we wanted.
Governor, where are you on masks? I mean, some people are going to like mandatory masks now. Where are you in Connecticut and you as governor of Connecticut?
Yeah, we have said for indoor use, for stores and the such, you have to wear the mask. That's the rule. And I was sort of interested, David, reading today that the National Retail Association said, I'm tired of having 50 different rules for when it comes to masks. Have a national standard, say masks are required inside the stores. That would make our lives a lot easier. That's the National Retail Association.
And most public health officials agree that that's one of the things that we could do to really save lives, save people from infection, but even save people's lives. So what's the hesitancy? Have you talked with federal officials about the possibility of a federal standard on this?
They're reluctant to have federal guidance on things like that. You've got to ask them. The messaging coming from Washington has been a little confusing for us. That's why we as governors here in the Northeast like to speak with one voice so we could have a consistent message.
One of the things we've heard a lot about is certainly testing, but contact tracing as well. I saw a report having to do with Connecticut that suggests you could reach out to 97% of the people who are infected, but only 47% would agree to participate in the contact tracing. Is that a problem for the contact tracing to really be effective?
That is a problem. We now have the infrastructure in place, as you point out. We can reach out to just about everybody in a real time. We do it by telephone, we do it by text. We try and say, look, if you care about the family, you care about the friends, the people you've been in contact with, please let us know who they are. But there is some hesitancy out there. Young people are at the party, don't want other people to know who was at the party, that type of thing. And we're working with the communities to impress upon people how important it is you share this information.
What is your policy at this point on the schools reopening? This is certainly something President Trump is focused on. Yesterday, he really said he was going to urge governors like you to make sure you open your schools. We had Vice President Pence out again today. At the same time, we had Mayor de Blasio here in New York City saying, if we do this, it's going to be like 2 or 3 days a week kids can go to school. Where are you in Connecticut?
Because we have an infection rate less than 1%, because we're meeting all the metrics, we are planning to open our schools on time in late August, September, a normal school day, so there's not a lot of back and forth, some days on, some days off. I think that's better for the kids and certainly for the employers and getting our economy going again. They like to know what the work schedule is of the people who are working for them.
Are you going to test employees, at least, if not students, before they go back?
Right now, that's not the CDC guidance, but we do have 160 testing centers. They're available free of charge, symptomatic or non-symptomatic. So for those teachers that want to be tested, we're going to make sure they have that opportunity.
Governor Lamont, we all hope this goes beautifully for Connecticut and for the rest of us, for that matter. At the same time, do you have contingency plans? Do you have contingency plans that you could cut back again, in some schools at least, if there are problems, and go to a remote learning?
I'm afraid we do, David. I mean, we've seen how fast this flare-up can spread like wildfire, looking at other states. So we have told K through 12, make sure we have a contingency plan, and in particular our colleges. I mean, they're thinking hard about how they might have to move back to online learning if, in fact, there was a flare-up in the residence halls and the such. I think it's terrible, by the way, that you're not going to let foreign students attend our great universities here in Connecticut if it involves distance learning. That sends the wrong message, and that's coming right out of Washington.
Well, as you suggest, Governor, you have some pretty big, important universities there in the state of Connecticut. How are they doing? What's going to happen to them financially, given what's happening right now? Because you have both increased costs and perhaps reduced revenue.
They're losing money in the residence halls in particular, where they can't be at full occupancy to maintain some distancing there. But right now, I believe all of our colleges, public and private, are getting going in August. They're going to start with some distance learning to get people up to speed, move people into the dorms slowly, maybe over 2 or 3 weeks, so there's not a mad rush going in there. And they plan to have a mix of online as well as in-person classes, knowing that they may have to take a turn if there was a flare-up.
Governor, when you were last with us, you said that you thought perhaps the days of the routine 5-day-a-week commute from Connecticut into Manhattan may be over. What changes in patterns have you seen since then? Has that reinforced your view, or do you have a somewhat different view?
No, David, it really has reinforced our view, especially in southern Connecticut, where a lot of people would get on the train, then they get on the subway. there's a lot of reluctance about getting on the train, a lot of reluctance about getting on the subway. And I think people have found that you can have a nice suburban lifestyle, or maybe live in one of our small towns or Stamford, Connecticut. You can work out of there 2 or 3 days a week. And if you have to get into the Big Apple to take care of business, you could do that, but you don't have to live there.
What longer-term changes besides the commuting issue you just raised are you taking a look at right now? I'll give you another example. There are a lot of reports of people in Manhattan looking for houses up in Greenwich, up in southern Connecticut, and out in New Jersey. And what's going on with the real estate market right now?
The real estate market is very, very busy. People coming from New York, people coming from Boston. I think if they feel like this may not be the end of the end when it comes to the nature of self-quarantining, if you have a house with a little backyard, or you can get a couple of extra rooms at less cost than perhaps Brooklyn, it's a pretty good place to be. So I think you're going to see a dynamic change. Let's face it, for the last 20 years, young people wanted to be in the major metro centers. Now I think there'll be a little balancing out.
Well, Adam Smith would say that when there's increased demand, the price is going to go up. Are you seeing home real estate prices go up in Connecticut?
I think you are seeing some of that. Yeah, we've been pretty flat, as you know, for the last 15 years. So there's still a steep discount for Connecticut compared to New York City, for example. But you're right, there's a lot of demand, and I think you're going to see that reflected in prices.
So, Governor, let's talk about what, if anything, the state of Connecticut needs from the federal government. There's talk about another phase of stimulus or investment, shoring up the economy coming perhaps later this month. You've said you don't think necessarily we should be extending that $600 supplemental unemployment insurance claim. Why is that?
I'm trying to do everything I can to get people back to work safely. That's how we're going to get our economy going again. That's how I'm going to stabilize finances in our state. So I thought, look, there are other ways you can use those federal dollars rather than just true up the unemployment. For example, you know, we've lost hundreds of millions of dollars just because not just our income tax revenue, but our sales tax revenue is down a lot due to COVID-enforced restrictions. And we've got to be prepared for that. Thankfully, we have a big rainy day fund, so we can power through for the near term. But if this lingers on for another year, we're all in big trouble. So I really need the federal government to step up and help out the state and local governments and give us more guidance on education as well.
So it's great that you have a rainy day fund and it'll tide you over for a little bit. When does it really start hitting you? If you don't get some direct support from the federal government for the Connecticut budget, when do you start having to cut costs? And let's be frank, that's often laying off people.
Well, we're already trimming. There's no question about that in anticipation. I think Connecticut's in good shape through this calendar year, maybe a little beyond that, depending on what the balance is. We're assuming as our economy gets back towards normal or close to normal by the end of this calendar year, well, Connecticut will be in good shape. If this falls over, if there's another big flare-up in November, you know, we'll see what happens.
Governor, obviously this pandemic and the economic problems that have followed the pandemic are a big crisis. We also have had a crisis in this country having to do with systemic racism following the heels of that tragic killing of George Floyd. Tell us what is going on in Connecticut. I understand you may be calling the General Assembly into special session to address some of at least the policing issues.
We're definitely going to do a police accountability bill as part of our special session in the next couple of weeks. We tried to lead by example with our state police and make sure that when it came to community policing, take out the militarization, focus on the community policing. And I was really pleased that during some really important protests in and around the George Floyd murder, our state police were also often arm in arm with the protesters. We had very few arrests, very little violence. And for that, I was thankful that the police and the protesters were, in many cases, aligned, at least in terms of their goals.
What about the more fundamental underlying issues, besides the policing of some of the inequality, economic inequality, income and wealth, that we have across the entire country? You also have a version of it in Connecticut. What can we do to address some of those issues that really set up perhaps the police and the police for failure?
Yeah, two big focuses for me in our state is one, education. We have one of the biggest achievement gaps between extraordinary suburban schools and some of our city schools that we've got to make investments in. We need more social workers. We need more social support, as well as STEM and coding. So we're making a big effort to upgrade those opportunities there for each and every one of those kids, especially the ones in the cities. And secondly, we put a lot of money into new business startups, especially for people of color, making sure they get that opportunity. We have a $45 million fund. I think 38% of it went right to people of color to make sure they can power through and start up their business and achieve their dreams.
Yeah, fascinating. Finally, Governor, let me ask you about voting come November. We've got a big election coming up. What's the situation in Connecticut with respect to absentee voting, mail-in voting? It's a big controversial subject, as you know, across the country.
Why is it so controversial? A majority of states do it. Red states, blue states is not particularly partisan. Obviously, in this environment, everything is getting partisan. In our state, look, I'm telling people over the age of 60, I'm telling people with pre-existing conditions, stay safe, stay home. And that means we got a primary in August. That means we have an election in November. And I want to make sure they can exercise their rights through absentee balloting. So we've got a little push and pull on that, but I think we're going to get that passed.
And do you need something through the General Assembly to get that done? And if so, when does it get enacted so people know how they're going to be able to vote?
Yeah, I have emergency powers, so I can do it for August. But when it comes to the November election, I need the legislature to step up and say, if you feel like you have some health risk, you don't have to go wait in a long line at a voting booth. We'll do absentee balloting for you, no questions asked. And I noticed that the CDC just recommended the same. That's good news.
So, Governor, I told you finally I'm going to fib to you now because we got a question from a viewer that I really want to ask you. One of the viewers wrote in and said, how's your pension system doing up in Connecticut?
We need some work there. There's no question about it. The politicians made big promises, didn't put money into the pension for 40 years. And we have an unfunded liability. That said, we're pushing through some reforms. We have a fair number of people that are going to be retiring in the next year or so. And we're managing it. The main thing I'm trying to do is hold down the increase in costs so our fixed costs become a smaller and smaller piece of our budget over the coming years.
Okay, Governor, it's a great pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for so much of your time. That's Governor Ned Lamont. He is governor of the state of Connecticut. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. And it's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. A grim milestone here in the United States. According to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University, the number of confirmed coronavirus cases in the United States has topped 3 million. More than 131,000 Americans have died. The U.S. accounts for more than a quarter of all COVID-19 cases globally. President Trump is speaking out against the CDC. In a tweet, the president said he disagrees with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's, quote, very tough and expensive guidelines for opening schools. He added the CDC is asking schools to do, quote, very impractical things. The president has threatened to cut funding to schools if they don't open before the November election. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro says he's confident that he will quickly recover from the coronavirus thanks to treatment with hydroxychloroquine. On Tuesday, President Bolsonaro said he had tested positive for the virus. He's been downplaying the severity of the illness for months, while deaths in Brazil soar. He said today his fever had subsided, something he attributed to hydroxychloroquine. The drug has not been proven effective against COVID-19. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for a market check. And for that, we go to our colleague Scarlett Fu. So, Scarlett, tech is really on a tear today.
It certainly is. You look at the NASDAQ 100 and the NASDAQ Composite, they are at record highs. They've come back from their best levels of the session. And indeed, the S&P 500 has pulled back as well. But that is the bright spot in markets across different asset classes. Still, when you look at the different asset classes, it definitely feels like there's a note of caution in the air. The dollar is lower versus all the G10 currencies. We see gold prices above $1,800 an ounce, really a showcase for the fact that there's still a lot of demand for safe havens. I want to focus in on technology, though, because the mega cap tech names have really been driving the advances, and we're seeing names like Amazon, like Apple, like Facebook, all at record highs today, and that's been the trend for a while now.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me, Scarlett, there was a time not too long ago when the tech names really went up or down based on our relations with China because of trade concerns. Those have entirely gone by the way. Now it feels like at least people are saying, let's bet on tech because even if the coronavirus comes back, we'll still need tech.
Yeah, absolutely. Tech has become kind of a safe haven. I mean, it's a barbell strategy. It's both growth and safe haven because of their strong balance sheet, their cash hoard, and of course, that undiminished demand for their products and services, and has held up so well during this pandemic and during this lockdown. When I look at the S&P 500's 24 industry groups, there are 3 tech subsectors that are among the 6 best performers. You've got software, you've also got hardware, and you've got semiconductors as well. And I bring this up because NVIDIA is now the biggest U.S. chip maker. It has soared past Intel in terms of market cap. NVIDIA higher for a 7th straight day. There's no real specific catalyst for today, but we know that there's been growing demand for NVIDIA's graphics chips in data centers and in AI, whereas Intel has been a little bit more reliant on PCs, its main source of business. And now with NVIDIA's recent advance, it is now the 3rd biggest chip maker in the world after TSMC of Taiwan and Samsung Electronics of Korea. David?
That's fascinating. I didn't know that about NVIDIA. That's fascinating, Scarlett. Thank you so much. That's our colleague Scarlett Fu reporting on the markets today. In the meantime, coming up next here, we're going to talk to Rufus Yerxa of the National Foreign Trade Council. We can talk about the USMCA, trade with China, and also, oh, by the way, a need for a new head of the WTO, somewhere where Rufus used to work, so he knows terribly well. Can they get it done by August when Mr. Acevedo steps down? That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The president of Mexico is arriving at the White House today as the USMCA, that successor agreement to NAFTA, goes into effect. We welcome now Rufus Yerxa. He is the president of the National Foreign Trade Council. Earlier, he served in, among other positions, as the deputy director general of the World Trade Organization. Rufus, great to have you back with us. Let's spend a minute or two on USMCA. It's finally getting done. Is it going to make much of a real difference as a practical matter?
Yes, thank you, David. Good to be with you. Well, as a practical matter, it is important because it reduces uncertainty about whether this agreement, this whole North American trading relationship, which has been in existence now for 25 years, is going to change dramatically or continue. I mean, there are some marginal improvements in the USMCA, but I think the most important aspect of it is it increases the degree of certainty that we will keep an open North American economy. There's less risk now of a president or a Congress turning its back on this agreement, although there are still threats, as you know, even today on aluminum from the Trump administration to impose new restrictions. But I think it creates greater certainty. We're hopeful that it settles the situation. Won't make a dramatic difference in imports and exports or investments immediately. Over time, I think it'll strengthen North American trade.
So you anticipated a question beautifully, Rufus. Is it really going to create that much more certainty? Because as you say, the Trump administration has continued to threaten tariffs on aluminum. At the same time, you've got Senator Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, saying, boy, this does not take care of the agricultural problems either. And President Trump has shown he's willing to impose tariffs no matter what the agreements are saying.
I think that's the biggest concern is how much will the Trump administration abide by an agreement they just negotiated. The president has shown a penchant in the past for, imposing new restrictions, notwithstanding deals he's making. So, that becomes a question of trust between the partners. But I think there are limits to how much you can do that sort of thing if you want to, if you want to tout this agreement as something good and new, which the Trump administration wants to do. I mean, they want to use the political benefits of it, and they can't really turn their back on the agreement.
So Rufus, talk to us about your old organization, the World Trade Organization. You also, by the way, worked for the United States Trade Representative, but you worked for a good long time, I think 11 years at the WTO. It is about to be leaderless come August, with Mr. Azevedo having stepped down. There's a lot of contention. There was even before he announced he was stepping down. What are the prospects for getting somebody into leadership at the WTO in time?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge. There are a number of candidates that have already come forward. I think today is the last day for candidates announcing. I see that the UK is putting forward their former Trade Secretary Liam Fox. There's a couple of 3 candidates from Africa. There's a Korean. There's others around the world. So it will be a challenge. I think that the process in normal times, if Azevedo had stayed to the end of his term, the process would have taken about 9 months. Since he gave his announcement only in May, it's an abbreviated process, obviously, to September. But the real challenges aren't so much the process. You have to carry consultations and narrow it down to 2 finalists and then get a consensus on the final candidate. That's a challenge. But the bigger challenge, David, is the politics of it. How do you get US, China, European Union, other big players not to disagree with each other's choices? And, Ambassador Lighthizer, for example, has put some pretty strict conditions down and saying of the kind of candidate he'll accept, with a fundamental commitment to changing China's practices. That'll be hard for the Chinese to accept his candidate, and vice versa, probably. So I think maybe a lot of people will be looking to see if they want to delay this past the U.S. election.
Well, exactly. That's the question. Particularly for China, don't they have some incentive to just slow walk this, saying, you know what, there might be a different president effect? Although it's not clear, given what is being said now by Democrats and Republicans, that whoever occupies the White House is going to go soft on China.
No, I don't think it's a question of whether they'll go soft on China. I think the Europeans as well, who, as you know, have had a number of points of friction with Trump, might say, well, maybe we ought to wait a while and see how the U.S. election comes out. I think the calculation will be, if Trump gets reelected, we'll have to make our peace with him and we'll reach agreement on somebody. But if Biden gets elected, why would we want to be saddled with someone that, we had to make a compromise with Trump to get? Maybe we'll get a better deal. I don't know what these countries are thinking, but certainly that might be part of their calculation. And we'll see. There have been periods in the past where there was not a sitting director general and they have to appoint an acting one. There's a process for doing that. That might be the case now. And remember, the WTO isn't just the director general. Director general is actually not that strong a role in terms of powers. There is a chairman of the council that's appointed by the members. There are chairmen of the various committees. So the WTO keeps operating even if there's not a sitting director general.
All of which raises a question in my mind, at least, Rufus, is the WTO up to it, no matter who leads it as a practical matter? Because when we come down to the 2 largest economies in the world having a fundamental difference about how you run your economy, the extent to which it's state-driven or not, is there any WTO that can really take on that fundamental an issue?
I've said to you so many times before, David, that the WTO system, like the GATT before it, is essentially a contractual relationship among major trading countries. And if the partners in that contract aren't agreeing with each other about things, there's very little a director general can do to alter the realities of a major breach between the partners. So the main role of a director general is try to figure out how to bring them together and create grounds for compromise between them. But that depends on the goodwill and the willingness of the countries to do it. My sense, particularly of the U.S.-China relationship, is at this particular point in the relationship, there's very little chance of, them crafting a path forward together in the WTO. It's more likely they're going to have a number of disputes in the WTO. And so we're looking to the future. Over the next several years, can we get back to doing business with each other in the WTO? I think that's going to be the big challenge.
Okay, Rufus, as always, it's a treat to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Rufus Yerxa. He is the president of the National Foreign Trade Council. And now it's time for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. New York City still plans to open public schools in September. Mayor Bill de Blasio said today he anticipates a blended learning program. Students would be in class 2 to 3 days a week, and families will have the option to choose all remote learning over in-school programming. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling on the European Union to pull together to tackle the challenges stemming from the coronavirus pandemic and climate change. Chancellor Merkel took over the 6-month rotating EU presidency this month. The EU's member states are grappling with a proposed $845 billion recovery fund. The ambitious plan has met with resistance from a handful of member states who are concerned about the cost. Candidates from Britain and Saudi Arabia have entered the contest to become the next Director General of the World Trade Organization. As David and Rufus Yerxa were just discussing, they joined 6 others aspiring to lead the Geneva-based trade body that has faced scorn and pressure from the Trump administration. The WTO's current chief, Brazil's Roberto Azevedo, made the surprise announcement in May that he would leave the job a year early. At the U.S. Supreme Court today, 2 key rulings involving religion. Justices upheld the Trump administration rule that lets employers use religious grounds to opt out of the requirement that they offer free birth control in their health plans. Meantime, the court also gave a victory to religious schools. Justices say the Constitution gives faith-based groups broad power to hire and fire employees who carry out important religious functions. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up next, we're going to talk with former South Carolina Senator Jim Demint on his new book, Saving America from Socialism. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Jim Demint served as a senator from South Carolina, and then he went on to found and be chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute. He's also the author of a new book, and it's entitled Saving America from Socialism. We welcome now Senator Demint back to Bloomberg. Great to have you here, sir. So I want to start actually with the title of the book, because I think sometimes the words really make a difference. Socialism is one thing, and I think has a particular definition, control the means of production by the state. Social welfare is somewhat different. Do you draw a distinction between those two things?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, I think a free market system is important to create prosperity, and generally that works for the large majority of folks. The social welfare includes safety nets for folks for various reasons who could fall through the cracks. But what we've seen through history is that the free market system has done more to pull people out of poverty than any social welfare system that we've ever created. So, David, I think the dynamic we need to consider is if you're killing capitalism in order to provide more social welfare, those things work at opposite ends. And so it's not one or the other. But if you want prosperity that can take care of everyone, including the poor, then we need to make sure our free market economic system is working.
And in reading your book, Senator Demint, one of the important points I took away from it is it's not just a matter of economics, it's a matter of freedom and personal freedom, going back to Hayek and people like that. Let's apply your analysis to the here and now, where we have a very unusual situation, I think we can agree, the pandemic leading to really the shutting down of the economy, where we're in a pretty deep recession right now trying to claw our way back out. Do you take issue with some of the actions that have been taken either by Congress or the Fed to try to support this economy right now, at least for the time being?
Well, my main issue is shutting down in the first place. I think we used worst-case scenario data about the health threat to shut down the largest economy in the world. It was supposed to be for 2 weeks to level the curve, in effect, which turned into 3 months, and still we have a number of states who are trying to stay closed. And the more you listen, the more you realize that, hey, healthy working age Americans are at very little risk from this. We've got good data now. And so my issue is we cannot lock down the economy again. We can argue about what was done right or wrong in the first place, but to create worst-case scenarios as an excuse to shut down our government was a big problem. And I think what we've seen here, David, is a little glimpse of what happens when people who are in power use some crisis as an excuse to take control of our lives. If you sit down and think about it, for the last few months, we've had governors and mayors telling us whether we can open our business or not, which businesses are essential, who we can meet with, whether we can go to church, whether schools can open. I mean, this is a little glimpse of what it's like when we give government too much power. And I think what we've seen here is when folks, particularly those on the left, who have this excuse to take power, are more than willing to do it.
And certainly all of us don't want an overburdening government. We don't want to turn everything over to the government, which I really interpret as being socialism. But at the same time, when you have a virus that really crosses between people and goes around, don't you have to have some rules? Because the fact is, what you do in exercising your rights and your liberties might affect my well-being.
Yeah, exactly, and it's something we have to weigh. But I mean, there's little question now that we did overreact. I mean, we didn't know all the data in the beginning, but what worries me now is we have the data, particularly about school-age kids or kids in college. Very little risk of getting it, very little risk of being hospitalized, certainly very little risk of death. And we're still not responding properly on an economic perspective. What we're not doing, David, is balancing the risk. There could very well be, with all the spending and borrowing and printing of money, some economic failure point that we're not anticipating here. And I just don't think we can completely ignore the downside of closing down an economy and putting millions of people out of work. And we've had thousands, if not millions, of small businesses who have closed probably permanently. And so the damage here has got to be weighed. And we know the risk is primarily to folks over 80 who have very serious other health conditions. Most of who've died have been in nursing care. We need to take care of those, Dave, but we don't need to apply the same restrictions on young people. Right. Because of olders. Now, that doesn't mean it's not simple. I mean, young people go visit older folks, but no one yet in the medical community has said, hey, if we stay home, we're not going to get it. They've told us from the beginning, you're likely to get it if you can get it, but we're just trying to delay it. The fact now is we've got plenty of hospital capacity. We know how to treat it better. The death rate is plummeting, although you don't hear about that. You just hear about infection rates. So I think there's been a lot of alarmists here, and I'm afraid most of it is just directed at the election.
Yeah, fascinating. It's a really interesting book, a very provocative book. And I'm delighted to say that the former Senator from South Carolina, Jim Demint, will be staying with us in the second hour of Balance Apart to talk about it some more, applies to some different situations that we have right now in the United States of America. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to talk with our Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, Matt Winkler, for his take on the Trump economy. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. President Trump came to office promising we're going to have a robust and growing economy, but then the pandemic came along, which makes it almost impossible for the economy to be back on its feet by this November at least, which requires him to have a second term or not deliver what he promised. In the meantime, Matt Winkler, our Editor-in-Chief Emeritus at Bloomberg, has written a piece really evaluating the Trump economy, giving him sort of a report card, as it were, about why we're in the trouble we're in, and we welcome him now. Great to have you back with us, Matt. Basically, as I took it from your piece, if we have a bad economy, President Trump has some of the responsibility for that.
He does indeed, because healthy people in a healthy economy are inextricable. And from the moment we knew this was a global pandemic, which you could say was the beginning of the year, the Trump administration, led by President Trump himself, dismissed it out of hand. He said it would go away. He didn't in any way advocate any of the prerequisites for controlling or containing the coronavirus, such as masks, for example, contact tracing, social distancing. All of these things are very important to making sure we contain the virus. And instead, what happened, he left it to the states. Some states did all the things that you should do, like New York, for example, Massachusetts, but other states didn't. And so this free-for-all created havoc, confusion, and now we are left 6 months into the year, starting the second half, with uncertainty and a resurgence of the virus. And we probably could have, like other countries, contained it by April had we followed a regime that was coordinated and led from the top, which is, of course, the federal government.
So accepting your analysis as you've laid it out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I was going to say, unfortunately, if you like, the punchline is massive unemployment that dwarfs unemployment anywhere else in the developed world. And there's no likelihood that we'll recover to anything close to what we had before, January. Just isn't possible to get there. So it's going to take years maybe for us to get back to the low level of unemployment that we had.
So taking all of that analysis you laid out for us, do you find some deep irony here? Because the president apparently was motivated in part to encourage people to come back in order to save the economy, because I think he may have been really worried about the economy and its suffering, and maybe that hurting him in re-election. Is there an irony here? Because he was trying to do the opposite.
Well, yeah, I suppose there's an irony, but right in the middle of all that is his massive defiance of science. And the science and the scientists tell us we have to figure out a way to control the virus first before we get to the point where we can make the economy as robust as we'd like it to be. That's why I say they're inextricably linked. Those are the scientists, the doctors, the people who know the most about the subject talking to us. And Trump and, his enablers did just the opposite. They ignored the science and they ignored the scientists.
One of the things that President Trump says and people around him say is, look, the economy was in great shape before this. It's just that pandemic, nobody could predict a pandemic, couldn't really anticipate that. So it's not if you're President Trump, my fault. Does he have a point there that the economy was in pretty solid condition going into this?
Hey, Hong Kong was going through all kinds of political convulsions. And Hong Kong has a lot more experience dealing with pandemics, going all the way back, for example, to SARS at the beginning of this century. And Hong Kong's economy, for all the political turmoil that it's been put through, has performed so much better to the point where the coronavirus is insignificant. Now, why use Hong Kong? It's a very densely populated part of the world. So the people there know how to deal with this. Of course, they all know that masks are essential, and that's very different from the behavior of the United States. If you go to Germany, Angela Merkel really worked with all of the state governments in Germany and got a coordinated response. In France, Macron shut down the economy, and it is doing better now recovering than the U.S. is doing, because he also had a systematic approach to dealing with the crisis. The U.S. is the only place where there was not a systematic approach. It was chaos from the start, and unfortunately, it's still chaotic today.
So we have 4 months to go, roughly, to the election. Is it too late for the president to make a real difference in the economy at this point, given the fact that there seems to be a certain momentum to this disease? It lags what actually is going on.
David, you have far more astute political analysts talking to you every day on your show than yours truly. Having said that, I look at the polls just like you, and I don't think it's a coincidence that since the coronavirus became so virulent in the United States, that Trump's popularity, his approval rating has plummeted. And even, parts of his base seem to have peeled off a bit to the extent that, his numbers are atrocious right now, 6 months from the election. Does that have a lot to do with, the pandemic? I think it does. I think there's no question that people are reacting or responding to the lack of leadership dealing with this crisis.
Matt Winkler, thank you so much for being with us. He, of course, is Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus. In the meantime, coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power on radio, we're going to be talking with Mike Summers. He's the president of the American Petroleum Institute. That's continuing on Bloomberg.